So can you share what your thought process was and then like what was the starting point in terms of writing this book? I mean, it's like thick and it's not like, it's not like a 10 pager or something. This is actually pretty difficult, especially, to the type of detail you go to. I'm sure it was quite a challenge, was it?
Well, it wasn't really a challenge. It was a joy. I've been a Dream Theater fan forever, and I've known most of the guys pretty closely. And the interesting quick backstory is a couple of years, I don't know, maybe 4 years before the album came out, I think they were in town touring, and I told John, I said, you should let me write a book, and you should do a concept album. And he kind of looked at me and said, that's an interesting idea. And then fast forward, and when I heard them announce this, I shot him a note, and I said, you should let me write the book to this. And he said it's interesting because when he conceived The Astonishing, his hope was it would be the album, of course, but then it would be a game and a book and a film and a Broadway production. He really wanted it to go everywhere, and he still does. And so they had already started some work on a game, and but he was very thoughtful about it, and he said we talked. We had a couple of long phone conversations, and then I said, okay, well, I'll be auditioning to do it. Which is fair because it was very intensely personal project for John, and though we were good friends, he wasn't just going to let me do it. Had to be right. So I said, all right, John, pick it. He had already sent me the album, so I was lucky. I got to hear the album 6 months before everybody. I said, pick a song, and I will write a scene in the story related to the tune. And so he picked Savior in the Square, and so I commenced to write a scene. And my first question to him was, do you want me to be slavishly exact to what you've done? Because there's the lyrical sort of narrative movement from you can follow with the record. John had written some sort of song summaries, and then he had a longer document that went into a little bit more detail. And he'd sent me all of this stuff, as well as the visuals that they had at the show. So I'd reviewed all that. And he said, no. He goes, I want you to feel free to invent and go beyond and really blow this out. So that was hoping he would say that, because then I wouldn't have any constraints. And so I proceeded to write that. I sent it to him. He loved it. And then, we did the legal thing. We got a contract in place. And then over, I think it was 7 or 8, 3-hour phone conversations that we would have. They were on tour, actually, at the time. And but he would call me after he got back to his hotel, and we would Skype like this for 3 hours. And we just crawled through the story, and I would ask him all kinds of deeper questions that weren't answered by what was on the pages I had, because some of it was in his head. And then what I found is as we were starting to do that, the story I wanted to write that broadened what he had created began to sort of form in my head. And so I started to pitch him ideas on things I wanted to do. And we had several moments together where we got chills, because we just thought, these things that I wanted to add would be help so much to bring the story to life. So after that long, and I took notes on all this stuff while we were doing these Skype sessions. And after that was done, then I had all of the information that he had. I had all my notes and all of our discussion. And then I started to write. And we did just check-ins so I could ask him some questions here and there. I'd text him. And then there were times when I would have an idea and I would shoot him a note and said, hey, this is what I want to do. I just wanted to always be sure we were on the same page. But he loved it. He loved everything. And when I finally finished the book, I sent him the manuscript. I said, he's so busy. He's not really reading a book a day type of guy. He said, I might not get to this right away. And I said, it's okay, but it's important you read it before it goes into production. So I think it was 2 days later, he Skyped me back, and he spent, I don't know, must have been 2.5+ hours just telling me how much he loved it. He had started to read it, and he said, I didn't plan on reading because I read almost the whole thing straight through. And I think, it's personal for him because it came out of his brain, but there's just some things in there that, like I got the map, and if you look at the map, there's all kinds of things on the map that aren't a part of the story at all on the album. And I made it a point to have the story work in such a way that it can incorporate some of those things. For instance, there's up in the sort of northwest corner of the map, there's a place called Fort Truth. And I decided to incorporate that into the story in an ironic way. And John loved that. And so there was just all of this this information that I plumbed. And then I just was able to sit down with what I had and then create additional, as I write the book, things would occur to me to extrapolate and to make larger. And I've had a lot of people say, because it's, to be really honest, it's a very polarizing album for them. They have fans that really do not like it, and then they have fans who just adore it. And I just recently joined a Dream Theater Facebook group page, and someone had bought the book, and they read the book, and then they listened to the album after they read the book, and as they listened to the album, they were reading the lyrics. And they said, having read the book, the experience of going back to the album, their words were, it was amazing. And a bunch of other people jumped on and said, yeah, I find that if people are haters on the album or don't understand it, whatever, I just tell them to read the book. So that's very gratifying, because I think, there's things in there people just would hate on, like the names John chose, like, Lord Nefarious. It sounds so cliche or silly. But what John had to do is he had to use a sort of shorthand to communicate things very quickly, because you only have, even if it's a 2-hour concert, there's only so much information you can communicate about the story. And so that was a shorthand for this is the villain type of thing. And what I did is, once you get into the book, I even worked on a short story that gives you the reason why he has that title. So a lot of this stuff, what I did is I sort of built the rationale behind a lot of the stuff that's in there. And so, an album, you can debate whether an album should need a novel to explain it. But the truth is any sort of 2-hour story experience is going to have holes. It's going to have gaps. It doesn't have the time to plumb the depths that a novel does. Yep. And so the novel ultimately goes so much further than the record does. And I'm very gratified that there have been some people who read the book who now go back to the record and like it better, because I think the record's amazing. I respect those guys so much for taking time to develop character themes and all of this kind of stuff that composers do when they try and do music storytelling. Most of the concept albums we hear, they don't incorporate this. Not that they aren't still good concept albums, but you don't know a character by its sonic footprint inside the record or the stage presentation. That's something that's done in opera or it's done in musical theater. And these guys like John and Jordan, they spend a ton of time, and so you can it's still legitimate not to like a song because it's just not your thing. But I think at the base level, it's worthy of your respect for the musical effort. But because I'm also a musical theater fan, it scratched that itch for me, because I would know when characters were going to be entering and the feeling of it, because they had thought about what it would sound like, what that character's sort of sonic personality was. And all of that stuff, I know it's a long answer again, but that stuff was relevant to me to understand all of that for the storytelling, so that I could capture John's and Jordan's sense of a character. And then what I'm able to do as the writer is add layers and layers of character development. So Lord Nefarious isn't just an evil mustache twirling villain. He's a guy that is the way he is because of damage that he's had to himself as a young person. And so you can start to sympathize with the choices he's making that are tough choices or unpopular choices. And I tried to do that same thing for all of the characters. Faith, for instance, some people, I've seen some criticism, it's like listening to Disney, when you're listening to the record and to Faith in particular. But when you read the book, Faith is hardly a shrinking violet. Yeah. Faith is actually a very, very intelligent, clever diplomat. So all of these things sort of, I think, give substance to the record and to the story John was telling. And I think that was one of the things he was happy about.
Oh, I think that's really important. And I think like you said, I think if one listens to the record, a lot of things may not make sense because maybe sometimes people don't see the connection between, like you say, for example, the song title and the song, and why certain things are named that way or written that way. And I think that book certainly would help add a lot of depth in terms of helping someone understand why things were done a certain way, but in a more dramatic manner, if in the book. So the question is like, so obviously this was John's baby and John's idea. So and it was kind of your job to add more layers to whatever thoughts he had in his head. So in terms of ratio, when it comes to the book, how much of the book came from John? And then how much did you have to add? How many more layers did you have to add? So on a scale of 10, say what would you rate John's ideas at?
Oh, that's an impossible question to answer.
Or was it like a to and fro kind of thing? It was like together. You did it together the whole time.
Well, no, partly because John's so busy, we couldn't be, on the phone every day. We couldn't be, he was not writing chapters and that sort of thing. So the process was for me to get everything John had in materials, and he had quite a bit. And by the way, one of the things we did with the book is we included the stuff that John had written. He has a full summary. He has song summaries. We put all of those in the book so that fans could see everything that John had created as he was sort of really trying to piece this together in a robust and holistic way. I had all of that, and I did as I said, I did all the calls. So I tried to front load most of what I would need from John, so that then I didn't have to use a lot of his time. Like I said, we did some texts here and there, and we did a couple of less lengthy Skype calls during the process. But mostly I was just sort of on my own to do it. The spine of the story is still the same, and I think timeline is still the same. I didn't mess with the timeline at all. So there'd be no story without John's conception. But he did give me latitude to do a lot of what we call it in writing, world building. So in in this area, this Northeast area with this particular regime, there were huge areas of that John had spent time developing as part of the concept that they don't ever surface inside inside any of the materials. And so and that included, like, there's an early chapter where there's a raid, and the resistance conducts a raid against a convoy of the authoritarian group in order to get supplies and stuff, and there's a battle. That doesn't exist at all inside anything. but it grows out of the very real conflict that John establishes between those two factions in, you know. So in that way, he did establish a framework up front, but the idea of the need for the rebels to go and to attack a convoy for supplies. Yeah, I was mentioning Fort Truth. You know, that doesn't exist anywhere except as a name on a map. But I decided, you know, as I started to write the story, that Nefarious, as a leader, he would have a disinformation and an intelligence network. And so I used Fort Truth as an ironic name for the place where, you know, his intelligence operations sit. And he pays a visit to that as he's trying to understand and infiltrate and ultimately suppress the rebellion. There's other diplomats you'll find in the book that don't exist anywhere inside the record that are an important part of the movement in the book, where the rebellion's trying to create more of a confederation of outliers to fight, you know, against Nefarious, and all this stuff I created. I created technology. I created some of the magic. So we know that you know, there's that music is kind of central, and that it has this sort of power, but it's not really it's not given any real definition. And so one of the things I did was I created an actual almost sort of music magic that it plays in particularly in the climactic battle in the story, and that didn't exist at all in the record. And so and John was so cool about it, because he let me kind of go inside his world and do all of this stuff. Mm-hmm. So it's hard for me to put a percentage on it, because I tried to have the things I did grow out of the sort of bed that John had laid down. Mm-hmm. But so much of it at his request and because of his grace in the whole project, it was stuff that I was able just to create. Mm-hmm. So I don't want to give it a percentage, because I don't want to claim too much credit, and there's no way I would ever suggest that John doesn't deserve all the credit in the world for trying something so ambitious. But the way I would leave it is he was gracious to let me play in his universe and do a bunch of stuff that, you know, gosh, at one point I said to him, we could write a whole nother album with all the additional information that I've created. And he laughed, and I don't know that they're ever going to do another concept album at this level again.
Who knows? Like, I mean, this whole thing was suggested like a few years before the album was launched. So maybe in the next few years you'll see them doing exactly what you suggested again.
Well, the thing I did when you read the book is, obviously he's from that area, so he focuses on the Northeast of the United States, and I mentioned that there are other sort of fealties that have established themselves, and there's, you know, this is part of the role of Faith. She's a diplomat, and she's coming back from like a trade mission that she's been back west. Mm-hmm. And so I said there's all kinds of other kingdoms that we don't even, you know, I've created now. I was just teasing him, but it is true that there's a lot of room for storytelling inside in the world now, because we just developed it so much. He did tell me, he said it was he did find it important and valuable that not that I was a Dream Theater fan, although that certainly helped, but that I understood music. I had been a performer. There were a lot of things, elements of that were important to him, I think, and he was thinking about those when I sort of auditioned to do the book. That he could have confidence that I would inject into the process, and you know, it would have been hard for him, I think, to find another writer on the planet that is probably as enthusiastic a fan as I am. You know, that's a metal fan and Dream Theater fan and a writer, and I think he knew that too. But going back to what you said before, when we would get on those late night calls, I would have assumed John would be beat, but he had so much passion for this project that he would just liven up. We would get talking about it, and we would talk late into the night. And he was always just like lively and engaged and excited. And it would be the middle of the night, and sometimes, most of the time, we were on in different time zones. Mm-hmm. So it could be super late for him when we were doing this. And he was always, he was so excited about this project, and his heart was so in it that he was engaged all the time. And even still is whenever we, touch base for one thing or another and it comes up. He's, it's unfortunate that there are some fans that panned it. I don't understand that. I respect that they have their opinion. But John, this was a really meaningful record for him. And it shows in his love and his passion for it.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a documentary right there. I'm serious. I'm not even kidding. I'm sure like so many people would be so interested in how the album came about and how this book came out of that one crazy idea that he had, and I think a lot of Dream Theater fans would grow to love the album even more when they actually see the amount of work and commitment that went into getting all this done. So I do think like a documentary is like necessary for this.
It might be like this album might kind of be like a wine that gets better with age. It might be albums that people in their initial reactions to it, over time, hopefully they'll find more of the substance in it and appreciate it more. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know if we'll ever revisit it. I would love to sit down. John and I did a thing on I think it was Instagram, where we did a live thing together and answered questions. But I'd be up for it if he ever wants to do it, to do something to cover like the genesis of the whole thing and talk about it, because it is interesting. Even if you didn't like the record, it's interesting how it all came about, and it's interesting to hear John talk about all of that. I tried to capture a bunch of it in the book, how he got the initial idea and that sort of thing, but it's so much different when you can hear him talk about it. Yeah. Maybe I should shoot him a note. And say, hey,
yeah, do it.
You're not touring. You're at home because of the virus. Like, let's record something that people want to know.
Yeah, exactly. Like, who knows? Like, I'm sure. I mean, if who knows? I mean, he might agree to do it because he's home, and like, obviously he's got a bunch of other things to do. But then if he agrees, I'm sure it will be the bomb, because I think a lot of people would be very interested about how this whole thing came about, and I honestly think that a lot of people will grow very fond of this album and also the book because of all the hard work, if they actually see the hard work that went behind making this happen.
John and Jordan, they did start a short video series where they started to talk about this. And I think they only did 2 of them, and then they got busy. And I found those fascinating, just as a musician, quite separate from anybody's opinion about the album, how they arrived at, putting the album together. Because those 2 kind of did the woodshedding together for several months to write the record. I think I don't know. They both live in New York. They're probably both sheltering. Be interesting if they finish that series, but I'll shoot him a text. I'll say, look, man, I think you should maybe if it's just a video thing that we record, but there's, just the other day that Facebook group, Dream Theater Facebook group, a bunch of people jumped on and, they expressed appreciation for the record and for the book. And, it's not like it's an international bestseller, but the folks that are Dream Theater fans who found out about the book, I've had a lot of very nice email from people about it.
And I mean, you deserve all that love, to be honest, and I really think so. I really think so. Well, you never know. I mean, let's hope to see a documentary like a few months down the line. All right. So, the next question I wanted to ask was that, how long did this entire? I mean, obviously, it took a lot of effort and a lot of time, and I bet a lot of late nights as well to get this done, and not just from John's end, and also from your end as a writer. So how long did this entire process take, from the very first discussion till, the day it was signed off as, the final version?
I think it was about a year, because if you start from their very first announcement, you remember they did that whole sort of secretive reveal. They announced that they were going to be doing this. And I shot John a note and said, "Hey, have you thought about doing a book?" And so if that's the instigating moment, which I think was in September, it was when I had wrapped up. I think it was the writing and sent John the finished book. I think it was about a year. And part of that, I didn't need to take that long. Part of that's just schedules. There's a big chunk of doing a contract. Legal stuff just always takes time. And we proceeded in parallel with, doing the contract piece. We proceeded with some of the creative conversations, John and I, all of that. But then there's the, as much as we did spend time talking, John was on tour. And so those several calls we did came over the course of, I don't know, probably 4 or 5 weeks in order to get those in. And then once I had all of that stuff, then I drafted the book. And then I went back over the book once to do some polish before I sent it to him. So I'd say a year. And I actually think that's really good when you consider everything that kind of could potentially make it drag out longer. But yeah, that's about a year, I think.
Oh wow, it's not too short, but then it's not exactly long either for a book of this sort of depth. I think so. It's amazing, and so then what was the cutoff point? I mean, in a way that I always ask this question to musicians, when do they sign off their record as the final version, because obviously amendments can go on and can go on forever. So not just for this book, or any other book that you write, what's the cutoff point? What makes you say, okay, this is it and this is going to print? So what's the point?
It depends on, one of the big dependencies there is who's publishing it. So for most books that go, well, a lot of books that go through traditional publishing channels, like Random House and Putnam and all those big publishers, the writer will have a contract, and they'll have what they call a publishing season, a time when the book is going to be released. And so there'll be a work-back schedule whereby the book has to be turned in. So the writer will work to that deadline, and then there'll be subsequent deadlines of revisions based upon editor's notes and those kinds of things. So the writer, and there's two general camps in terms of writing approach. There's one that is sometimes called the architect or the outliner, and then there's one that's called the gardener or the pantser. And they basically describe someone who does a bunch of outlining and pre-writing and sort of story structure and plot creation. and the person who does almost none of that and just
Mm-hmm.
finds their way as they go. And there's very successful writers in both of these camps.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Having the outline and everything before you even start writing means you pretty much know what the ending is.
Mm-hmm.
The other one can take longer because you're kind of making story decisions as you go, finding the plot, and you may make some bad decisions and have to back up and change.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm the former type. I do a lot more sort of outlining, and in this case with John, we already kind of had the spine of the story.
Yeah.
So if you're not going through a traditional publisher, and the first instance of The Astonishing was a limited edition book. It was a leather bound, and it had interior full color art,
Mm-hmm.
and there was a limited number of those. I mean, it was kind of almost like a Dream Theater collector's item. We kind of had a time that we wanted to get that out for. So I was working, ideally, and John will tell you this too, ideally we would have had the book available when the record came out.
Mm-hmm.
But they didn't really start, like I didn't even start my calls with John until the record had already released.
Mm-hmm.
If you hear John talk about it, what he'll say is what if he could do it again, what he would want is he would want the book done, and he would want the first availability of the book as you come out of the theater, having just
Mm-hmm.
seen the performance, and then be able to buy the book, just like when you go to a Broadway show.
Mm-hmm.
He thinks that would have been really great for you to be able to get the book, then. But the timing of things just, they were so busy with the record. And the record, we try and capture some of this in the book. There was, like, the orchestrations were being done, I think, in LA and then someplace in Europe. So
Mm-hmm.
they had, like, these different elements that were being done in different places of the world. And it's such a complicated project that he didn't really have time as the mastermind to be overseeing every potential creative vehicle for the story.
Mm-hmm.
So they for that reason, it didn't sort of release the optimal way in his mind that it should have released. But once we did come to the agreement, we had a small press that did this limited edition collector's item of the book. And so I was working against a timeline with those guys to get it out. And then once that was all finished, I said to John, I said, there's a lot more people who might want to read this story, because we didn't really know what the appetite would be for it. So
Mm-hmm.
we did this beautiful book with all this interior
Mm-hmm.
color art, and those are expensive to produce. I said, do you want to maybe do it as a cheaper version? And he said, yeah, let's do that. But that was later. And so the one that you just held up is that, and it came much later.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, I don't know if they'll ever do a big concept album again, but if they did and they wanted to do a book, I think we learned a lot about how we would do it differently next time.
Well, I'm sure, I mean, I'm hoping that there will be another one, so let's hope that happens. And I'll definitely check out the limited edition one. I didn't know that we had something like that. Sounds really cool, but I might not check it out either because it will make me sad for not being able to get one. So, but we'll see.
I might be, if you're really interested, they're not cheap, but I might
Really?
be able to get your hands on one.
Oh, really? Like, but when you say not cheap, like, can you be a bit more specific with that?
Well, I think that they originally retailed for $75 US,
Mm-hmm.
but now the few copies that are available they're more rare, so they're more expensive than that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not
Okay.
thousands or anything, but it would if I might know a couple that could be available for. You'd have to be a real hard Dream Theater fan to want one, because
Mm-hmm.
few people spend that kind of money on a book.
Yeah.
But it is if you're a Dream Theater fan, it's an amazing collector's item. And one more thing I want to say one of the things I've gotten a ton of requests about is you guys should do a book for Scenes from a Memory, because it's
Wow.
such a popular concept album from them. I don't know that that'll ever be done I think some of the former members of the group participated in that, and it would require some gymnastics around approvals and all of that kind of thing. But I have had a bunch of people who have read the book say, "Yeah, you should go back and do scenes from a memory." So I don't know if that'll ever be done or not.
Well, send John a text and see what he says. It's like, yeah, I would. You don't be surprised if you say, yeah, I was actually just thinking about that yesterday, and they'd be like, voila, there you go.
Yeah.
Oh man, but it is actually amazing how this band have been around for such a long time, and it's one of those rare bands where you have a fan base with such a wide range when it comes to age. You know, I mean, when I went to the show in London, in fact, it was like my first Dream Theater show, and that's where I got the book, and I was shocked. I mean, like, yeah, this is like my bookmark for the book.
Nice.
Yeah, so yeah, I was so shocked to see the wide range of age there, and it was like from very young to like, you know, people who were like, I think some were like over 60, 70. I'm sure some were, I'm so sure there's over 70, and it's just amazing how, I mean, how often do you find a band that has like such a wide audience, and you know, for heavy metal, progressive metal band to have that kind of audience is just crazy, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's, I think it all comes down to the amount of hard work that they put into their music, and likewise they did the same with, I mean, John did the same, and yourself did the same with the book. And oh, I nearly I mean, there were a few times I think my face was like that the whole time when I was watching them play, and I was like, oh, I couldn't believe that, you know, I was actually watching them play. And then I was so thankful that I saw this book at the stands, and I was like, I had to get it. It was a bit pricey. I think they sold it for like £45.
Oh, did they?
Yeah, so they sold it for like 45, but then well, I mean, I have to be honest, because prior to that, I had no idea that this book was out. And then one of the first things that drew my attention, caught my attention, was John signed this today. And then I was like, okay, yeah. And then after that, I remember after getting the book, I got in touch with you. I was like, oh, I have to get you to sign it as well, because, I mean, it's John's book, but it's also Peter's book, and I believe, like, you know, your autograph, like, you know, there's like space there, so it needs to be filled. You know, so yeah, so when you head to London, hopefully that's still happening. I mean, I'll be, you know, so honored to get you signed.
Yeah,
sign
you bet.
this one. Yeah.
I told John, because his original hope was that he'd be able to have the book on the merch tables. Mm-hmm. And so when I came back to him and I said, yeah, let's do a paperback, he says, that's perfect, then we can put them on the merch tables. And I told him, and maybe he was going to do this anyway, but I said you should, like, I don't know how much of your merch you would sign, but if books are something people like to have signed, I said you should just sign some at each show. And I think that will be a good, you know, enticement for people to want to do it. So it sounds like, at least with the London show he did, I imagine he did a few more places.
Yeah, I think he did, because I think if you check out his Instagram, I think he did like a video showing that he was signing some on the spot, like just before the show. And I believe London isn't the only show where he did that. So, but yeah, I'm sure that helped in terms of promoting the book. And then I believe everyone who starts to read it will definitely get hooked. And yeah, and again, like, the only reason why I'm not done with it is because I love it so much, and I have like so many other books next to my bed that I just literally scan through. I mean, obviously those are non-fiction ones, but then like some books I literally want to just finish them because I started. And then when it came to this book, every time I got distracted, I closed the book and I just refused to continue because like I didn't want to waste the precious pages, you know. And then there were times where I literally went back a few pages just so that I can re-enter that realm again before I continue on the with like, you know, the newer pages that I haven't got to yet. So that's how much I really appreciate your work, you know, and all the effort you put into this book.
Well, thank you. Yeah, once you're done, you should let me know what you think. I am proud of it. I mean, if you know the story from the album, then you kind of know the ending a little bit. Mm-hmm. But the journey to get there is so much expanded upon in the book. And then there's a bunch of my hope is that readers, once they have a deeper understanding and sympathy for the various characters, that the ending has more impact. The you know, how you think about the characters is more nuanced than is possible even in watching a 2-hour concert. Mm-hmm. And that was part of what John was really pleased about, is, you know, the depth of the characterizations, you know, how you could really get into why people made the decisions they made. And that's what, you know, that's what you try and do with any story, is to create some sort of connection with the reader around why characters do what they do. And I knew that was something I really wanted to try and nail, because there was, you know, people or early fans were they either didn't understand the naming conventions, or you know, thought that they were silly or whatever. And so you know, I worked hard to create rationale for why the names are what they are, and to give the character depth, you know, so that they would be really interesting. And I'm like, one of the ones I'm really proud of is I'm really proud of Faith, because once you read the book, she's a much deeper character than you would know if you only listen to the record.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let's hope that, you know, more people get this book after hearing this episode then, because I think it's so important. You know, obviously, you know, people do the same with movies. A lot of people, they watch the movie first, and then after that they get to find out that there's a book about that movie, and then after that they revisit the movie after they read the book, and then the movie means so much more to them. I mean, they either thrash the movie after that or they love it even more, you know.
Yeah.
So and I think I do believe that, you know, every Dream Theater fan should definitely get a copy of this in order for them to really to judge the album fairly, you know, if I may say that, you know.
It definitely, like, even if there weren't a book, and this is my bias, I still love the record. I feel like I sort of understood the story. I understood the point of view changes inside some of the songs, where it was going from one character to another, and they were having, they were talking or debating or whatever. So I really enjoyed that. But there is something to be said for having other kinds of art that work together, you know, different kinds of art that work together to enrich the experience of a story. And obviously it's done with film and with comic books and other kinds of creative ways to tell story. And I do think that in this instance, the idea was sort of grand enough. And that was John's hope. Like, his one thing, I'm not sure if people listen to him talk a lot about this, but the central conceit for the record and for the story, and obviously the book then, was around the idea that not just that music is important to humanity, but the act of creating music is important to humanity. And it was, you know, partly a reaction from him about all of this synthetic music creation. Not the use of synthetic sounds, but rather like artificially created music. And there's, even since the record has released, I'll read articles that come out, and I'll shoot him a link, and I said, this is what you meant. There, there's all kinds of AI being created to write and create music, and it's not even whether or not that music is good or not. What John was trying to his main comment was that the act of creating music is an important human function. Like it helps you as a human to create music, and then obviously built the story on top of that. And I think that's not to be too philosophical, but I think that that's a really important thing to explore. Not that everybody has to be a musician, but you could extrapolate that and say the act of creating something is an important human need. Like we need to create things, and abdicating that to machines, it's not just whether it's good or not. It's about what sort of deficit is left behind as a human and in the human family if we aren't creating, if we're not that part of us that is fulfilled and grows and is rewarded by doing that. And I know that I'm not a philosopher, but I feel that personally. Like when I create anything, whether it's awesome or not, there's a sense of satisfaction, and it helps me balance, and I think John wanted to be able to write a story that grew from that idea that hopefully we don't ever get to a place. I think he even said he saw some crazy video on YouTube of a robot drumming or something. He saw this video that was made him start spinning on this. So yeah, I think I don't know how maybe not everybody cares about that either, but it hit John enough that it sparked some of this story idea that, hey, obviously these guys have taken their craft to a crazy level, like they're all consummate musicians, but that's not even what he's talking about. He just, the idea or the act of creation, he thinks is a human expression is an important thing, and that was part of the first seed for him.
Yeah, and I think he makes a very strong and very good point there, because obviously, as the human race progresses, I think we are starting to lose a lot of that tactile and haptic sense when it comes to doing a lot of stuff, not just music. I mean, communication, we're communicating more than ever, but then we're actually talking to people face to face less and things like that. So, and I think that it's kind of related to what John is trying to say in, this whole book, so it's that human touch, that needs to be there, and not, I mean, AI can do anything better than the human. I mean, some people may argue that the AI will do anything better than a human being can or ever will, because obviously with algorithms and things like that, it can literally do anything better than a human being. But then obviously, whether it's still a debate whether an AI can actually capture emotions and things like that, and all that therapeutic benefits that come from the act of creating art. So, and that's why I think this book, it's such an amazing book, because there is such a strong core value that it's, building a story around, and I think it's whether someone plays music or whether someone's a Dream Theater fan or not, and I think if they actually take the time to read this, and if they are actually able to translate that message across other things, like non-musical things, it does make sense, if you get what I mean. I mean, whatever message that John or yourself is trying to convey through this book can be applied to other things in life as well. It could be art, it could be non-creative things, but it is, at the end of the day, it's that message where our world is losing that human touch when it comes to a lot of things. And I think that's a message that really needs to get out to a lot of people.
Yeah, it's that tension is expressed in the story between the nomacs, the noise machines, that it create music, and the way that I advance that in this story is it's actually they use this sort of discordant noise to suppress people and control people. So that becomes the insidious sort of outgrowth of manufactured music, and the antithesis of that, and is the rebels, Gabriel, who has natural. He creates music naturally, right? And so, and then for the purposes of tension in the book, I give that music ability power properties. So it's not just music, but he's able to actually do things. Yes, and obviously these come into conflict, because if the rebels build up belief in somebody and a resource around music that is a human expression, it kind of works against their authority, could thwart their authority and their ability to keep people in line by use of the manufactured music or sound. And so that's the tension that John had set up, and then I just kind of extrapolated on that. But yeah, even if you want to stipulate and agree that yes, machines and AI can do it better than humans can, that's not the point at all. The point is that humans need to be doing some of this stuff for themselves, because it's good for their soul, whether you believe in the soul or not. It's good for the human sort of health. It's good for your person to engage in these things. And it's like we've said, it doesn't need to be music. Most people have some sort of outlet that is an expression of their humanity, and abdicating that to a machine just it leaves a vacuum, and it was enough of a catalyst for John that he wrote his whole book about that.
I know, and it's amazing how he managed to do that. Wow. Well, so thank you for sharing all that. And to wrap things up, obviously I have to ask you, what's next for you? And the last, so that's the first question. The second question is, do you have any advice you would give to any musician or anyone who's aspiring to be a writer like yourself? So what's next for you, and advice?
So on the fiction side, I am working. There's a writer by the name of Brandon Sanderson, and he's a New York Times bestseller, mostly for big epic fantasy. And he and I are doing this series that is more of a contemporary fantasy, where the central character is a metal musician. And so I'm currently working on the first book in that series. That's what I'm doing on the fiction side. Although I've been approached there's a guy who's written a rock opera, and it's really interesting. It's very sort of dark fantasy noir rock opera, and he wants me to write a book to it. So may do that. On the music side, I started my own group a couple years ago called Symphony North. And it's very much sort of in the Trans-Siberian Orchestra genre. I don't know if they're a genre, but it's sonically it sounds like that. And I wrote my own sort of rock opera to tell a story, and that's called the band Symphony North. The record's called The Bell Ringer. It's a holiday story, and so I'm currently trying to find. I was represented by WME. Interestingly, turns out Trans-Siberian Orchestra is also represented by WME. So the short story is, now I'm looking for new management.
Okay.
So I'm looking for an agent because I want to be able to take that out more broadly. I probably will start writing the second record of that. People might want to check out some of the tracks. I had both James Labrie and Jordan Rudess.
Yep, I saw that one.
Yeah, they guested on my first record, The Bell Ringer, and that's just symphonynorth.com. So musically, that'll be the next thing I do. Is I did a short tour last year I don't know if anybody's going to tour this year with what's going on. So maybe next year we'll do a tour, a broader tour, and probably have a new album out. And then the advice I would give for writers, it's there's two things you can do to improve your craft, and it's to read and to write. And it sounds very glib, but writing is not different really from an instrument. In order to improve, you have to practice. And it's sort of a fallacy that you just get inspired by the muse and sit down and write something great. With writing, it's very much the journeyman mentality. You practice every day. You try and take advantage of resources. There's writers' conventions and conferences. You can get into writing groups. And if you do that and keep practicing and then reading, because as you read people who are professionally published, you see how they go about doing things, then you will improve. And then there's all kinds of ways to get to publication. So it's the biggest advice I have is diligence. You have to really, it has to be something that you want to do, because it's work. It's not all glamour, and so you have to enjoy that process. And it's work. And it's kind of the same thing with music. I think you have to practice. There is, I think it's like that. What is the old rule? Is like 90% perspiration, 10% inspiration. You could have the discussion or the debate around how much of it is innate. How much is your ability? Because I know a lot of guys who are as fast as John Petrucci is. But I don't know very many guys who are as fast as him and as good a songwriter as he is. It's not just blazing speed that makes a great guitar player. In fact, a lot of people argue it's not that at all. But even in the world of progressive metal, where those kind of chops are often kind of regarded highly or looked for, John's not only that. Like, he's a much more dimensional player. And so there's something to like what sort of inside you is the music expression that is authentically you, and you got to find that. You have to you keep practicing to get your chops up, but finding a way to express yourself with a song that is distinctively you. That's I don't think there's an equation for that. I don't think there's advice for that other than to continually be about it. I'm sure you've read the stories, of Mayung and Petrucci in the early days at Berkeley, where they were competing on how many hours a day
they spent. And then they were kind of obligated to spend that many hours before they could hang out, and it was like, it's just so funny.
I know.
And then they would feel bad if they see each other if they haven't practiced. Well,
and I think that the underlying principle, if you want to call it that, is there is an advantage to quantity. Ray Bradbury, who is one of the great forerunners of science fiction and fantasy writing, he was a writing teacher, and he would say the same thing: is from quantity will come quality, and it's like a byproduct of spending so much time at your craft that you'll necessarily improve. So being able and willing to stay committed to it, to the practicing and continually, and not being worried about failure, and learning from any miscues or mistakes you make, that'll build to success. It doesn't mean you're going to be a bestseller or you're going to win a Grammy, but those aren't the right motivations anyway. And Dream Theater is a good example of that. I think they did their time to perfect their craft individually on their instruments, and the sheer amount of passion and energy and time they've spent on their instruments has resulted in the ability to, they don't have to think about the mechanics when they want to express a musical idea and writing a song. And it's the same for fiction. Once you start to build the tools necessary to tell a story, you're not focused on the craft anymore. That's just sort of it's inherent, and so you can just go about the process of telling the story. But it takes time to develop those skills, and so what separates, I think, most success from people who don't have success is just the willingness to keep showing up every day to work at it.
Well, that's very valuable advice, and I'm sure a lot of people will feel inspired hearing that. And well, so with that, I would like to conclude our session today. And obviously, thank you so much for sharing all that valuable advice and also taking us through, the process of